Something you'll hear people say sometimes is, well, I've just about hit rock bottom, so I may have to turn to Jesus. You'll actually hear people say, boy, if I don't get out of this jam, I'll have to turn to Jesus. Or if somebody's in jail or something like that, they say, well, he did turn himself over to Jesus once he got there. You're thinking, what? Why should Jesus, the greatest man who ever lived, be the last option for desperate people? Well, this is even prophesied in the Bible. We know that Jesus compared it to a great wedding banquet where there was the noble and the rich that were invited, but they refused to come. And so, what society would consider the lower people are the ones that ended up at this grand banquet. However, it just doesn't seem right that Jesus should be this last resort for people. And it's just taken for granted that Jesus wants the riffraff. But this is nothing new. Did you know that back in Bible times there was people that said, oh, you're Jesus, huh? I've heard of you. Do the Jesus thing. Now watch. And Jesus said no. This is in a few places in the Bible where people wanted Jesus to react and respond to them, and he either said nothing or told them no. By the way, if you're somebody that Jesus is saying no to, you may be in a very bad situation, worse than you ever imagined. This is something we're going to be covering on today's show. Thank you for tuning in, by the way. My name is Tom. This is Juliana. Behind us is our show's mascot. His name is Sherman the Cat. Well, he's asleep right now, so we might get a little bit of peace and quiet to get some work done. We invite you to join us. You're watching Bible Tales. Well, a very famous story in the Bible is the rich man and Lazarus. You probably have heard of it. To give you a brief synopsis, there's a poor man named Lazarus. He's in a very poor state in the world, and he even associates with dogs. Then there's a rich man, a very fancy man, who is not named in the Bible. Some Bible scholars believe that it's actually referring to Caiaphas, the high priest of the time. Well, anyway, in this Bible story, both of these men die. Lazarus goes to heaven, and the rich man goes to Hades. He finds himself in Hades and immediately cries out to Abraham to cool the fires of torment. To which Abraham responds that there is a mighty chasm between their two situations to which no one can cross over. The rich man says, please, I have family members on the other side. At least send Lazarus to warn them so that they do not also end up in the fires of hell. Well, Abraham tells him they have Moses and the prophets. They can listen to them. And the rich man says, they will listen to Lazarus. To which Abraham says, if they did not listen to the prophets, neither will they listen if a man rises from the dead. This almost seems like a prophecy. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? If you will, please join us in reading Hebrews 11:6.
And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him.
This is a very interesting place in the Bible. It says for people to believe in God, he wants you to do it first. Before he reveals anything about himself to you, he wants you to believe first. You may say, well, that's not fair. That's not how it works. God says he is the rewarder of those seeking him. And you may say, well, it should be the other way around. That's not how God sees it. God says that he needs you to believe first. Otherwise, he's not interested. What? You know what? I think a lot of people are used to Jesus and God taking bad deals for themselves. That's kind of the trope that we see a lot. People that are the least desirable of humanity, they are cast off to the side and say, well, Jesus can take those ones. Could we also read Luke 11, verse 49?
Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute.
Well, how do you like that? Think of how God feels when he sends messengers. We know that God isn't in our world. God is not material. We live in a different surrounding from God. He is not here. He sends emissaries, and what do people typically do to them? They persecute them. Some of his emissaries, many of them, have even been killed for their trouble. For emphasis, could we also read Matthew 23 and verse 34?
Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will scourge in the synagogues and persecute from town to town.
This is a prophecy of God. He already knew in advance. By the way, for centuries, God sent messengers to people. These people that say they wanted, could God just do something for us? God sends messengers. For centuries, they were persecuted, crucified, and scourged. Every time God sends messengers, they end up being punished. For talking about God, people should be rejoicing for them, and instead they get punished. I think of when Jesus was brought before Herod, and Herod said, "Oh, I've heard of you. Do one of your tricks." Jesus just stood there like, "Are you kidding me?" By the way, Jesus did miracles in front of, he had thousands of believers, but Jesus did miracles in front of multitudes of people that just looked at it and said, and walked away. I remember one time I was even talking to someone that told me, if I could just see one miracle, I'd be on board with God. And I told him, I don't think you have any idea how grave our situation is. You think God is interested in doing parlor tricks for you? When you tell people that the heavens declare God's glory, they say, well, those are just stars. But why can't God just write God in the sky or something? I say, well, when God created the sky, there wasn't language like you and I speak. Well, I know, but still, in advance, right? Something. And you tell them, well, what about DNA? Human DNA? They say, what? The sequence of DNA is described as language. Some people compare it to computer code. It is almost identical to human language in its complexity. In fact, even more complex. And they say, well, I don't mean that. Something other than that. Astronomers that look out into the night sky and they see galaxies that are held together with something other than gravity. Well, we know in the Bible that Jehovah says he is the one who established the foundations of what you see around you. They call it dark matter. Galaxies of stars it's like having a pile of sand and spinning it around. The sand should go everywhere, and instead these galaxies are held together by some invisible force. In fact, it's something that has to be far more powerful than gravity. Some people think that dark matter is a cloud of dark dust or something. It's nothing of the sort. In fact, there is no such thing as dark matter. It's a term they use to describe something that isn't there. It does not interact with light or matter in any way, shape, or form. They call it dark matter because they haven't come up with a theory yet. There's also dark energy. If you ever have wondered how the universe could be bigger than the speed of light, well, in the Bible, Jehovah says that he is the one stretching out the heavens. Astronomers call it dark energy. They say that space is moving faster than the normal laws that people perceive, but they credit this to something that doesn't exist. Again, they've put a placeholder on something that they don't have an explanation for, isn't visible, isn't existing, and they say, we'll come up with a theory for it later. Well, that's fine, but it's just something to think about. People that are requesting miracles, there's miracles above you. Learn about them. I remember a few years ago when they had the James Webb Space Telescope that they were sending up in the sky, and they said they would look back to the early years of the universe. Very close to what they call the beginning of the universe. They were very excited. They talked about all the early mess of the uncreated universe that we were going to get to see. I had a feeling it might not turn out the way that they planned, and of course it didn't. I'll read you some headlines here. By the way, I did not write these headlines. I'm reading them. Space.com says, James Webb Telescope sees early galaxies defying cosmic rulebook of star formation. That was in September of last year. Let's read February. James Webb Space Telescope discovers enormous distant galaxies that should not exist. Live Science says James Webb Telescope finds ancient galaxy larger than our Milky Way, and it's threatening to upend cosmology. The Guardian newspaper says James Webb Telescope detects evidence of ancient universe breaker galaxies. Well, instead of seeing the disarray of a post-Big Bang disaster, whatever you want to call it, looking back to the earliest points of time, this telescope, and bless the people that put them out there, we're happy about these discoveries. When they look back to the farthest points of space-time, what they have discovered is magnificent, beautifully and perfectly formed spiral galaxies, larger than our own. And not long ago, I was listening to somebody say, "Oh, Jesus, he was a philosopher." You know, Jesus, I believe some of his teachings. Gee, he was a pretty good philosopher. Calling Jesus Christ a philosopher is low-key blasphemy. Jesus is not a philosopher. Jesus created all things. How could he be trying to figure them out? Preposterous. And people that say, "Oh, I agree with some of his teachings, you know, not all of them," but if you ask them about Jesus, they say, "Hell, he is the guy that said, don't judge, you know. Jesus said, do not judge." And you say, what else did Jesus say? "Well, that's all I know." I'll leave that there. I remember when I was in high school, there was a teacher that taught the class that math was invented by humans. It is a language invented by humans to interpret and describe the world around them. And when you're young, you say, all right, because of what you know of arithmetic and multiplication, you say, all right. And you can kind of understand that. But then when you get older, you start thinking, what about fractals? What about the Riemann hypothesis? What about the Mandelbrot set? Surely you're not saying that humans invented these things that they can't even decipher. If you ever get time, watch a video on the Mandelbrot set. You'll find it very interesting. This is a set of numbers that mathematicians call the thumbprint of God. Why? This is a group of numbers that will never repeat, and yet when displayed visually in a computer, repeatedly looks the same over and over, and mathematicians marvel at this because they recognize it to be the work of a genius. If you ask my high school math teacher, he'd say, if you ask him about things like trigonometry, he'd say, well, those are just things that exist by accident that we've discovered. So you invent half of math and then you discover the rest that was there randomly by accident. Some people will say, does your God do miracles? Let's see a miracle. I would never dream of asking God to do a miracle. How dare you? The only thing I pray for is that my friends, family, and people I know will finally see God and stop being blinded by Satan and his system of things before it's too late. That's my prayer. God says not to pray for selfish things. People that pray for miracles are selfish. Unless you're praying for a miracle for someone else. Of course, we know if someone is sick or in the hospital, to pray for their recovery. This is appropriate. These are the prayers that will find favor with God. God does not react to you. You have a misconception if you believe that. I also don't think you understand how bad the situation is. People don't know that Satan is demanding people. In the Bible, God says, I plucked these ones from the fire. It stands to reason that the world in mass is in Satan's fire that he is preparing for them. Some people say, well, I just don't know if I can believe in a God that would, make hellfire. Has it ever occurred to you that Satan is the one turning up the hellfire? When God looks down on earth, he sees piles of dirt. This is not God being mean. God is truth. And the Bible says, who is man that God should take note of him? Dust he is made, and to dust he will return. This is true. Do you want to deny this or just not think about it? We are made of dust, and we are in no position to ask God for anything. We know that we can ask God for things that are appropriate and he will give them, but we are in no position to make any demands of God. Ever. Even if we were perfect, which we are not, we are created beings. Not to mention that we are 6,000 years removed from Edenic sin. If you want to know why there's so many problems in the world, there's been 6,000 years of people rebelling against God, including the murder of the prophets, the murder of God's Son, the blasphemy of God's Son, the blasphemy of Darwinism, and now you want God to do parlor tricks for you. I wouldn't hold your breath. The other thing is, God doesn't need anything from you. If you don't believe in God, you're the big loser. Do you understand that? It won't affect God. He's going to keep going. These people that talk about, well, if things keep going as bad as they are, I'll turn my life over to Jesus, I guess. Thanks. If we had any inkling, I believe we would all drop to the ground and begin crawling if we knew what a thread we are hanging by. In the Bible, Jesus said if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could tell this mountain, be transplanted from here to there, and it will do so. Some people have interpreted this in the Bible as a metaphor, and Jesus did speak in metaphors largely. Some people say, well, this means that if you're somebody that is a Bible believer, obstacles will move out of the way for you one way or another. That's one interpretation. Has it ever occurred to you, though, that none of us have the faith of a mustard seed? Here's my possible interpretation. None of us have faith the size of a mustard seed, except Jesus. We know when Jesus returns at the second coming, the topography of earth will change for him. We know that when he sets foot in Israel, mountains will break to get out of his way. At certain points in the Bible, when Jesus' own disciples tried to expel demons, other things, and did not have success, Jesus told them, you don't have enough faith. When Peter tried to walk on water and ended up going for a swim, Jesus told him, you don't have enough faith. I think that's the problem here. People want to see miracles, but they're faithless people demanding miracles. That's not something God would be interested in, I don't think. One of my favorite quotes from a Paul Washer sermon, there is no such thing as a man of God. There are only weak, broken, faithless men and a merciful God. If you're somebody that is just complaining that you're not seeing miracles, you might need to do some self-correction about where things are actually situated and how things stand. Jesus Christ spoke of a wicked and faithless generation. That was 2,000 years ago. Before he was murdered, before his apostles were whipped and humiliated and even executed. What kind of mood do you think God is in? I've actually had people say to me, I want to debate you, but not with the Bible, okay? I told them, why would I ever entertain the notion of doing such a thing? I tell them, have a nice day. I would not be interested in ever putting down the Bible and saying, I'll just speak for myself. I'll ignore the Bible and speak for myself. Why would I ever do such a ridiculous thing? At that point, we would just be two piles of dirt, espousing our own worldly wisdom, spouting our own sound and fury, signifying nothing. No, I would not be interested in that. Of course, many historians don't consider the resurrection of Jesus to be a real event that happened. But something to think about. All historians, or I should say almost all, there is a broad, almost entire consensus that Jesus' friends and followers say that he rose from the dead. This is not something disputed by historians. We were watching a program called Decoding the Ancients. They were talking about the ossuary box of Caiaphas. If you don't know what it is, it's a limestone coffin, and this was discovered in the year 1990 when they were building a park in Israel. Well, they discovered an underground chamber, and it was the tomb of rich Judeans. And there were 6 coffins in there, and then some other broken lids of coffins and things like that. But one of the tombs was inscribed, Joseph, son of Caiaphas, or also known in the Bible as Caiaphas, the high priest who served from 18 to 36 in the first century and was, of course, famous for his interactions with Jesus. What was also interesting in the program, they say that they found 2 nails in this tomb. Of course, you probably are thinking of crucifixion nails. They say they don't know what the nails are for. It's possible that the workers of the tomb left them there, or somebody inscribing something left these nails there. But we do know from the Mishnah that the first century Jews, and this is hard to believe, but they were highly superstitious and did carry crucifixion nails. Of course, the Mishnah goes back to the 6th century up to the 1st century, but and crucifixion was a 1st century thing. So Jews in the time of Jesus, these rich Judeans, had this practice of carrying crucifixion nails as a talisman. It's something strange to think about. Is it possible that someone set these nails? We don't know. Again, we don't know the meaning of these nails, but we do also know that a woman who was buried in Caiaphas's tomb, it may have been his wife, they think it was probably his daughter, had a coin in her mouth, a Roman coin, which was the practice of the Greeks and Romans to have a coin ready in the afterlife to hand to the boatman who was the ferryman of souls crossing the river Styx. It's just strange to think about that these people that persecuted Jesus within a matter of years, I think everything started going crazy. We know that there's a tradition that's not in the Bible that Pontius Pilate, in his last moments, was wailing and weeping over his part in the persecution of Jesus. It seems like after the death of Jesus, after the whipping of the apostles, things really just started coming apart for the temple culture of the time. We know that many people left Jerusalem, didn't even follow these religious leaders anymore. I think during the insanity of the Jewish Civil War, they say that when they found the ossuary box, they recognized it as belonging to a rich man because it was fancy, but they said, we expected it to be fancier. But in the mid-1st century, the situation in Jerusalem was so bad that I also think that's why the tomb was absolute. I don't think it was modern day workers that broke these coffins and things like this. I think it was just the mayhem of the Jewish Civil War and the war versus the Romans. To me, this is what it looks like when the veneer of a religion is all that's left. It starts devolving into, these people that persecuted Jesus were faithless. They had no true faith in God, and the crumbling after effects, all that was left was this mixture, this strength, and this is a real thing. They call it the Hellenized Jews of the 1st century. These were sanctimonious people like the ones that persecuted Jesus, but this is a real thing where the Jews of the 1st century mixed their knowledge of Jehovah God with Greek culture and their false gods and their false teaching. It's the strangest thing. It reminds me of, in our modern time, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are supposedly the gatekeepers of all things Jehovah God, and how people have talked to me about it. They say, what's your opinion of this crazy devolving situation of how this Jehovah's Witness empire, where they were so harsh and punishing of people in the 20th century, and now they're dressing like worldly people, They're going to liquor stores. They've even been videotaped that one of the Jehovah's Witness leaders was at a liquor store buying cases of hard alcohol. And they say, "What, Tom, what do you think about this?" I say, "Did you never read of a wicked and faithless generation?" They used to call themselves the generation even. Well, we know the Bible says that there is no peace for the wicked. Anyway, thank you for tuning into Bible Tales this episode. It's good to see you. And we had a quiet episode because Sherman was asleep the whole time. I think he has the rainy day blues. Anyway, thanks again for watching Bible Tales. See you on another episode.